Canada has increased its oil exports to China by billions, and Trump just exploded. Americans definitely did not expect this. Today, I'll explain how this new oil alliance has left Washington at a loss, why Trump is once again threatening to make Canada the 51st state, and what consequences all this could have for the U.S. economy. The northern stream is changing direction. Imagine a huge river of oil that for decades flowed strictly south from Canada to the United States. In 2025, this river suddenly began to change its course, heading east toward China. And this isn't just talk, but hard statistical facts. Data from March 2025 show that Canada exported a staggering 7.3 million barrels of its oil to China. This is an absolute record. It is expected that this figure will be surpassed in the future. For comparison, just a few years ago, such volumes of Canadian oil exports to China would have seemed like science fiction. For example, in 2022, Canada's share of China's oil imports was just over 2%, but by early 2025, it had soared to almost 12%. This is the fastest growth among all oil exporters to the Chinese market in this century. At the same time, China reduced its oil purchases from the United States by almost 90%. At the same time, deliveries of this same Canadian oil to the United States, which had always been considered the main and almost the only buyer, began to noticeably decline. After the United States imposed new trade tariffs in March, throughput on some key oil pipelines, such as the Trans Mountain system, dropped from more than 800,000 barrels per day to about 650,000. This is a very significant decrease for American refineries. Trump is furious. When Washington finally realized the scale of Canada's oil maneuver toward China, Trump's reaction was predictably explosive and accompanied by new threats. The central point of his attacks on Canada has always been the so-called trade imbalance. Trump has repeatedly stated that Canada conducts business very skillfully. Speaking at the Economic Summit in Davos in 2025, he emphasized, the trade imbalance with Canada is too great. We will not tolerate it any longer. According to him, the U.S. trade deficit with Canada reaches between $200 and $250 billion. Although many American media outlets and economists consider this figure to be exaggerated, nevertheless, for Trump, it was a key argument. We don't need Canada to manufacture cars for us, the American president asserted. We make our own, we have our own forest, and we don't need their lumber. We have more oil and gas than anyone else. He also added that the northern neighbor could become one of the American states, which would eliminate the trade imbalance and avoid the introduction of tariffs. Trump's allies and prominent figures in the Republican Party, of course, did not stand aside and actively supported his tough stance toward Canada and China. In numerous interviews, television appearances, and on social media, they vied with each other to argue for the necessity and even the inevitability of the protectionist measures that the president was proposing or had already implemented. Threats from Trump's camp, and retaliatory steps were not long in coming, at least in words and in the form of threats. Let us recall that as early as February 2025, the Trump administration imposed 10% tariffs on Canadian oil and gas, as well as 25% tariffs on other Canadian goods, including steel and aluminum. This decision by itself sparked a storm of outrage in Ottawa. Later, Trump and his closest advisors began talking about the possibility of tightening these measures. 10% on oil. That was just a warm-up, a warning shot. Conservative publications quoted one high-ranking White House official as saying, options for expanding the list of goods subject to restrictions were also discussed, up to and including the automotive industry and agricultural products. This would have been an extremely painful blow to the Canadian economy, which is heavily oriented toward exports to the U.S. There were also proposals to unilaterally revise certain provisions of the USMCA trade agreement, which would have created legal chaos. The idea of a possible annexation of Canada began circulating again on American social media. Discord in Washington. Not everyone agrees with Trump. However, it is important to understand that the reaction in Washington was not completely unified. Representatives of certain sectors of the American economy, especially the oil refining industry located in the Midwest and on the Gulf Coast, expressed serious concern. They were well aware of how much their enterprises, with a combined processing capacity of millions of barrels per day, depend on stable supplies of heavy Canadian oil. In the corridors of Congress and at meetings with administration officials, there were opinions voiced that further escalation of the trade war with Canada could hurt American consumers themselves, leading to higher prices for gasoline, diesel fuel, and other everyday goods. Some analysts warned that the price of a gallon of gasoline could rise by as much as 75 cents. Some of the more moderate Republicans and some Democrats, although they shared concerns about China's growing power and its energy expansion, believed that Trump's aggressive tariff policy was counterproductive. In their view, it only alienates traditional allies such as Canada, pushing them into Beijing's arms, and undermines economic ties that have been built up over decades. How the US depended on Canadian black gold. To understand the full extent of American surprise and even resentment, let's rewind the tape a little. For decades, the United States and Canada were not just neighbors, but true oil brothers. Almost all Canadian oil, a colossal amount, over 4,100,000 barrels daily in 2024, which made up about 62% of all American oil imports, went straight to the US. The entire infrastructure was built around this. Massive oil pipelines, such as Keystone and the Enbridge Line 5 system, crossed the border, and American oil refineries, especially in the Midwest, in Illinois, Ohio, Michigan, and on the Gulf Coast in Texas and Louisiana, were technologically tailored, specifically for processing Canadian heavy oil, such as Western Canadian Select. This oil has its own characteristics. It is denser and contains more sulfur than the light shale oil that the US actively produces itself in the Permian Basin or the Bakken. American refineries have mastered working with it, producing gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and feedstock for petrochemicals from it. And importantly, Canadian heavy oil was often traded at a discount compared to global benchmarks such as Brent or WTI, which made its refining even more profitable for American companies. The China factor in the oil game. Now let's take a look at another giant on the world stage, China. The Chinese economy, despite some slowdowns, continues to grow, and along with it, its appetite for energy resources steadily increases. China has long and firmly held the position of the world's largest oil importer, purchasing over 11 million barrels daily, and it is constantly searching for new, reliable, and importantly, economically advantageous sources of supply. An important part of China's long-term energy strategy is diversification. Beijing aims not to depend on any single supplier or politically unstable region, that whether it's the Middle East with its perpetual conflicts or Russia, which is under sanctions. And this is where Canadian oil enters the scene, which, under the new conditions of 2025, has become especially attractive to China. For China, it is advantageous for several reasons at once. First of all, as already mentioned, Canadian heavy oil is often cheaper than similar grades from other countries, such as Iraq's Basra heavy or Venezuelan oil, access to which is restricted by sanctions. Secondly, Canadian heavy, high-sulfur oil is perfectly suited for processing at the most modern Chinese refineries, which have been built or upgraded in recent years and are specifically equipped to handle this kind of complex feedstock. The road to the east is open, the Trans Mountain Pipeline. So why has this Canadian pivot to the east become possible right now and at such speed and on such a scale? A key role here was played by one large-scale and much-troubled infrastructure project: the expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, or TMX for short. It was finally completed and launched into commercial operation in May 2024. After many years of debates, protests from environmentalists and indigenous peoples, as well as a significant budget overrun, which grew from just over 7 billion Canadian dollars to more than 34 billion. This event, without exaggeration, changed the game for the Canadian oil industry. Thanks to TMX, Canada gained a direct and significantly expanded outlet for its oil from the province of Alberta, where the famous oil sands are located, to ports on the Pacific coast. And from there, a direct sea route to the vast markets of Asia was opened. The capacity of this pipeline has nearly tripled, right? From the previous 300,000 barrels per day to an impressive 890,000 barrels daily. Just imagine this additional flow of black gold. And the results were not long in coming. Aframax-class tankers capable of carrying up to 800,000 barrels of oil began departing one after another from the port of Vancouver to China, Japan, South Korea, and other countries in the region. While Washington was absorbed in its tariff maneuvers and internal political struggles, Ottawa and Beijing began actively building bridges and strengthening their bilateral economic ties. This is no longer just about individual contracts, but a deliberate effort to establish a long-term partnership. In March 2025, it became known that an important framework agreement had been concluded between the two countries. And it wasn't just about oil, although oil was certainly a key element. They agreed to expand the supply of Canadian critical minerals such as lithium and potash, which are essential for the production of batteries and fertilizers, as well as agricultural products, canola, wheat, and beef. In addition, Chinese investments in Canada's mining industry, infrastructure, and even the renewable energy sector were discussed. Moreover, China's largest independent oil refiner, Rongsheng Petrochemical, opened its official trading office in Calgary, Canada, being the heart of the country's oil industry. And almost immediately, it signed a long-term deal with one of Canada's oil giants, Suncor Energy, for the supply of 100,000 barrels of oil per day for 10 years, starting in July 2024. All of this indicates that what we are witnessing are not random episodes, but the deliberate formation of new, powerful economic alliances that could seriously change the global landscape. Alarm at American refineries. Is an oil shortage just around the corner? Why is the reduction in Canadian oil supplies and the redirection of some of these flows to China so dangerous for the United States? I already mentioned that American oil refineries, especially those in the Midwest and on the Gulf Coast, have historically been geared toward processing specifically heavy Canadian oil. Their multi-billion-dollar equipment and technological processes, all of it is calibrated for the specific characteristics of this raw material. The light shale oil that America produces in huge quantities simply cannot serve as a full replacement for these refineries. The United States, despite being the world leader in oil production, producing over 13 million barrels a day, still remains a major importer because its domestic consumption approaches 20 million barrels per day and a significant portion of its refineries specifically require heavy grades of oil. Canadian oil played a key role here, meeting this demand. The situation is further complicated by the fact that Washington has previously imposed or maintained sanctions against other major producers of heavy oil, Iran, Venezuela, Peru, and Russia, seriously limiting access to their resources. The current escalation in relations between the US, Canada, and China is not a bolt from the blue, but rather the culmination of processes that have been brewing for years. To better understand the complexity of the situation, it is useful to recall the history of relations among these three countries, especially in the areas of trade and energy. For example, the trade wars that unfolded during Donald Trump's first presidential term had already seriously affected economic ties at that time. Let us recall, at the very least, the long and painful negotiations over the revision of the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, which was eventually replaced by the new USMCA agreement. Even then, tariffs were imposed on steel and aluminum, harsh statements were made, and mutual accusations were exchanged, all of which created an atmosphere of distrust. The dynamics of oil trade between the US and China have also always been complicated and depended on numerous factors, including the political climate and global market prices. China would at times increase its purchases of American oil, only to sharply reduce them, as happened after the introduction of US tariffs. The current crisis of 2025, with its tariff battles and the reorientation of Canadian oil flows, is essentially a new, even more acute round of these long-standing contradictions. Accumulated grievances, economic interests, and the geopolitical ambitions of all three parties have become tightly intertwined. What we are witnessing is much more than just commercial oil deals or disputes over tariffs. This is a real game of geopolitical chess where every move has far-reaching consequences and can shift the global balance of power. The emerging oil alliance between Canada and China, even if it has not yet been formalized, is already having a significant impact on the global stage. First of all, it is a clear weakening of the influence of the United States in North America. The closest ally and neighbor, Canada, is demonstrating increasing economic independence and a willingness to pursue policies that do not always align with Washington's interests. This is a serious signal for American diplomacy. Secondly, it is a strengthening of China as a global player. Beijing is gaining access to strategic resources, and the routes for these supplies, which pass through the Pacific Ocean, are partly moving beyond the traditional American naval control in other regions. Thirdly, the possible long-term consequences for the so-called petrodollar cannot be ruled out. If major oil deals are increasingly conducted bypassing the US dollar, ward, for example, in yuan or other national currencies, this could gradually undermine the dominant position of the dollar in global energy trade, which for decades has been one of the foundations of American economic power. Canada undoubtedly gains significant advantages in this situation. First of all, this is the long-awaited diversification of exports, which reduces its critical dependence on the American market. Secondly, it is the opportunity to sell its oil at potentially higher prices on premium Asian markets, where demand for heavy grades of oil is quite high. Finally, it is the strengthening of its economic sovereignty and greater freedom in making foreign economic decisions. China also clearly comes out a winner. It secures its growing energy security by gaining access to stable supplies of quality raw materials from a reliable partner. At the same time, Beijing can count on more favorable pricing conditions compared to some other suppliers and strengthens its geopolitical position as a global economic center, capable of forming trade alliances that are advantageous to itself. However, for the United States, the situation looks far less optimistic. This includes the already mentioned risk of destabilizing the domestic fuel market and rising gasoline prices. The loss of part of the Chinese market for its own, albeit not so significant, oil, as well as a weakening of influence over its northern neighbor and key trading partner. On top of all that, there are also certain reputational losses on the world stage. So what could Washington's response to these new challenges be in order to minimize losses and try to regain lost ground? There are several options, each with its own serious risks and potential advantages. The first and most obvious path, especially if an administration with a tough approach to trade remains in power, would be to continue and even intensify tariff pressure on Canada and China. However, as we can see from the example of 2025, such a policy may lead to further escalation of the conflict, retaliatory measures, and even greater economic isolation for the United States itself. The second option is to try to establish a constructive dialogue, especially with Canada. This could involve reconsidering some of the most egregious tariffs, finding compromise solutions, and attempting to restore shaken trust. This would require Washington to be flexible and to acknowledge the changed realities. The third path is to try to compete directly with Canada for the Chinese oil market. But this will be extremely difficult given the current political tensions between the US and China, as well as the clear preferences that China now gives to Canadian suppliers, including for pricing reasons. Finally, America could place even greater emphasis on developing its own production of light shale oil, and more importantly, on building new or upgrading existing refineries capable of efficiently processing specifically American grades of oil. But this is a very lengthy, capital-intensive, and environmentally challenging process. So, we are witnessing the global energy map being redrawn before our very eyes. The oil maneuver by Canada and China is not just a one-off deal, it is a symptom of profound changes in the global economy and politics. The old rules of the game seem to be losing their effectiveness, and new, ambitious players are stepping onto the stage, ready to challenge the established order. This is a story being written right now, and its ending has yet to be determined. One thing is clear. It definitely won't be boring, and we will continue to follow this gripping geopolitical drama.